Thank you, Jenny. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I
See
can.
me okay. Thanks very much. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, I'm Steve Foster. I've been at Coventry for a long, long time. I did this webinar last year. Some things might have changed. I don't know whether they have in terms of what sort of exams you're getting now, whether you're going to get carrying on online or you're back in the exam hall, etc. But just a couple of things. We're going to cover all eventualities. I am going to assume to start off with that most people are doing online examinations, and there will be specific slides giving specific advice about how to prepare for those. But I'll also cover time-constrained exams or unseen exams as well. The other thing, I suppose, is that a lot of what we're going to talk about today is generally relevant to all forms of assessment, whether it's an exam, a time-constrained exam, or whether it's a coursework. We're going to concentrate specifically on exam skills, but a lot of it will transfer to courseworks, things like structuring, answering the question, using legal authority, etc. So hopefully it'll be of use to a lot of people. So I've entitled it Exam Techniques in the Post-Pandemic for the reason I've just explained, but we will try and be flexible. Really, there will be different exam formats and expectations for you in examinations now. And this session is going to hopefully give you some advice on how to revise and prepare for law exams, particularly online exams, how to prepare and act on the day. Just a few tips about how you should be organizing yourself on the day. Something more general, which is about constructing answers to law essays and problem questions, particularly if you're doing them online with quite flexible or generous time limits. What to write and what not to write. I'm not going to tell you to post your examination questions up and give you any model answers, but I'm going to give you some tips on how to find out that what you're writing is actually relevant, and an equally important skill, leaving out stuff that isn't relevant. We'll see that can happen. How you can use primary and secondary sources in exams. I think the main difficulty of law, studying law and answering law assessments as opposed to anything else, is the rules of law are not necessarily more complex than the rules of philosophy or history, sociology, but it's using legal sources to support your answer, which is really quite difficult. So we're going to give you some examples of how to do that. Just some tips on citing and referencing sources. That is very different, usually very different in examinations rather than courseworks. Proofreading and checking your answers. Again, you've been told that since year dot at school. It's obviously important in relation to all assessments, but is of particular relevance to examinations. Although I've taught most subjects, apart from equity and property, to me, that's pure sorcery. I don't know how people manage all that, but I think I've taught almost everything. But I'm going to give some examples at the end of contract and tort law and answering questions in public law and human rights. But I might make reference to some other of my subjects, which are employment law, public international, constitutional, etc. So I'm not sure how you're sorting this out, Jenny, but I think this is the first question that they will be able to participate in.
Yeah.
I really want to find out what sort of exams you're taking this year. Are they open book, online and all day, which is what's happening at Coventry? Are they open book, online and limited to 2 or 4 hours? Or are you back in the exam hall with a closed book and limited time? So over to you, I think, Jenny and the rest.
Okay, so people have already started voting. You should see it pop up on your screen. If that isn't working for you, then just put it in the chat box as well. That's fine. So it looks like most people have voted.
Can I vote as well?
I don't think you can. You could give it a go, but
Oh, it says hosts and panelists cannot vote.
okay.
After telling students read the instructions, I've now found the instructions.
Right, I'm going to end the poll. Everyone has voted and show the results. So the it looks like most people are doing open book online and open all day, which 47% of people are doing. And then after that, it's pretty much, it's even actually. So it's open book online and limited time, 2 to 4 hours, or closed book and limited time. So that's an even spread across those two.
Okay, so I'll probably spend a little bit more time than I thought I was going to spend on the traditional old-fashioned exam. And I suppose that's the one that really puts the EBGBs at most students, having to go into an examination hall without your materials, and that poses all sorts of difficulties. The next, are we going to do these now, or
yeah, we can do them now. So same as the last one, one more option than it was before. But what is your main anxiety about taking exams? And the options are the time constraints, remembering sources, case names, etc., answering multiple questions, or concentrating for a specific time. Okay, nearly everyone's voted now. Last second. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now and share results. And it looks like it's remembering sources, case names, etc. is the one that people are most worried about. And then after that, it's time constraints, and then concentrating for a specific time, and then answering multiple questions.
Okay, right. Well, let me just, we can close that and I can just look at them in turn. The time constraints, I think a lot of people really did struggle in the past and still struggle now if they have to do something in 2 or 3 hours, particularly if they're given more than 1 or 2 questions to answer. It's not such a problem, of course, with the open book unlimited time where it's open for 10, 16 hours, etc. Although we'll see that poses different challenges. Remembering sources and case names, again, if it's open book, that doesn't become a great challenge now, unless of course you haven't done the necessary preparation and you're searching around looking for those particular sources. That doesn't become a real problem in the open book long sessions. Obviously, it remains a problem with the closed book, but I think students tend to obsess about this and perhaps overestimate it. If it is closed book and you haven't got the materials in front of you, there's no need to panic if you can't remember the name, let's say, of a case. Because I think a lot of students really used to get wound up about that. I've got to remember all the names and titles of these cases and the years, etc. Sometimes it's perfectly okay to say, in a case where the facts were such and such, and the court held this, we know what you're basically talking about. You don't want to necessarily get into the habit of doing that every time you mention a case, but don't worry if you can't remember the name of a particular case or the section number of a particular statute, if it's closed book. If it's open book, then obviously the rules change and we'd expect you to. And I know a lot of students are saying, now this is unfair because you expect more of us now in the open book exam where we've got 16 hours. Well, naturally we do in certain respects. Answering multiple questions, not many put that down as a real problem, but in my experience that is a real problem, in the sense that particularly in the first year, students tend to do one really, if they're asked to do 2 or 3 questions, they do one really well, The second one, not so good. And the ones that are failing, no third question at all. And I got the impression that what they really found difficult was that they had to revise and prepare for answers in 2 or 3 different areas. They're fine with one area, and that's why they like courseworks, because they concentrate on one particular area, but they struggle when they have to look at more than one specific area. So that's something that well, there's no getting away from it. You've got to prepare yourself for at least 2 areas. And the other thing is that if you've got a general overview of the subject, something like contract and something like constitutional law, even if you haven't done a great deal of specific revision for that second or third specialist question, you can, I wouldn't say waffle, but you can blag your way through it to a certain extent, because you're aware of the crossover between, let's say, judicial review and separation of powers and what have you. So I would just say there's no magic formula there. Just get yourself ready to answer questions on more than one area. Because I say, in practice, although it didn't seem to be a problem in your poll, in practice it is a problem. And concentrating for a specific time. Old people are always telling young people, you've got the attention spans of butterflies, and because you can't concentrate for longer periods, for long periods of time. So that is an issue. Because normally students like things in bite-sized portions, and they can move on to the next thing and flit about from one source to another. And you've got to concentrate your mind for a couple of 2 or 3 hours, particularly if it's a closed book exam. Again, not so much of a problem if it's open book and for 16 hours, because although you're only going to be physically writing for 2 or 3 hours, you could be flitting in and out. So those are just the issues there. And the final question I think we've got is, what skill do you find most difficult in exams? Is it answering the question, structuring the answer, providing legal authority, or organising my time?
Okay, everyone's really sort of sprung into action here. They know what they're doing now. So we should have some quite quick voting, I think.
I expect a lot of people would say, can't we put everything down? And that might apply to all of the questions that we've asked so far.
Okay, so we've got a couple more people that need to vote. Looks like we're nearly there. Like I said, if you do have any issues voting on the screen, then please do feel free to pop it in the chat instead. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the screen. So we've got 42% said structuring my answers, 26% said organising my time, and then it's equal between answering the question and providing legal authority.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's structure that seems to be the main issue. If we take that away and just talk about those particular options. Structuring the answers, I don't think that's peculiar to examinations. I would say if we asked the same question in relation to coursework, students saying the problem I'm always getting, the comments I'm always getting back is I need to structure my answers more. Those are the ones that being quite truthful. Most students say, oh, I failed because I didn't know the Oscar system, and it's unfair that I should have 30 marks taken off because I didn't know the Oscar system. That's absolute nonsense. We're not going to take any more than a few marks off. But I think that's interesting, structuring my answers. I think it's a problem generally with assessments. And I think the problem comes from the fact that students don't look at the question properly. They look at the legal area it's about and then write everything they can or everything they know rather than everything they're supposed to be writing. But that's specific in cases of the examination, because you've managed to maneuver yourself to the examination, keeping all this stuff in your head. And when the bell goes, off you go, you can start writing. All of this sort of vomits onto the paper, and it just streams. It's a stream of consciousness. And you want to get rid of all this stuff that you've been keeping for perhaps a couple of weeks. And it's not a particularly sound strategy. And we'll have a word later on about really looking at the question, even in the time constraints of a 2-hour examination, looking at the question and saying, right, what is it about? What is it not about? Can I get rid of certain information? Can I concentrate on certain information? And that all-inspiring thing, the plan. Look at the question and say, what is it generally about? Well, it's generally about negligence. What is it specifically about? Whether the law of negligence complies with public policy and what problems that's created, and concentrate your answer on that. Providing legal authority is not just a problem in terms of remembering it, but in terms of what you do with it when you access it, whether you actually remember it out of your memory or find it on a piece of paper in your online exam. What do you actually do with that legal authority? Because in a lot of cases, students' answers get worse when they actually use legal authority. They're bobbing along quite nicely when they're dealing with the general principles and talking about the facts of the problem question. But when they actually use the legal authority, they get into all sorts of problems. Organizing my time, I put that down because, again, a lot of people fail to do well in an exam, either because they have one fantastic question and the other one either is average or it stinks, or they don't even bother with the second or third question. And that could be because they don't know the answer to the second or third question, but often, particularly in time-constrained exam, is about organizing their time and spending an hour and 3/4 on one question and thinking that they're going to get a good pass mark in a question which they spend 15 minutes on. So that is a particular issue as well. So in terms of exam techniques, the main thing is find out immediately, or as soon as you possibly can, what form of exams are you going to take, and get this information from the lecturers and not your fellow students. So is it going to be online and open book? Are you going to have almost an indefinitely long time, all day, etc.? Are some of the questions going to be seen? So seen questions can apply either in an open book or a closed book examination. And sometimes they release the questions in advance, which takes off a lot of pressure, but then again puts more pressure on, because quite rightly you're saying, well, if they've shown me the question in advance, they want a really good answer to it, perhaps a better answer because I've got more time to research it. The benefits of the online exam, and I assume that most people were doing that, but that's not necessarily true, but concentrating on that for the time being, the benefits of the online exam is that you've got a wider opportunity and a longer opportunity to prepare your answers and materials, consult your sources, and get ready for the show on the day. You've also, if you've got a long period of time, got that opportunity to revise your answers and proofread. The difficulty, and I'm not talking just about exams, but I'm talking about the pandemic and tuition, is that some students have really struggled in the lack of face-to-face interaction and tuition, whatever form the exam is going to take. Students have been asked to take more initiative to learn, because at Coventry we've reintroduced lectures and seminars face to face, etc., but there's still a lot more for the students to do now, because the year before we were preparing mini lectures and videos, recording lectures. There's a lot more initiative now placed on the student. Go up and watch those videos, do your own reading, etc. Some students like that, some students don't. They like the safety blanket of going to that lecture, 3 times a week or twice a week, etc. So there is that difficulty. So this isn't a problem about exams as such, it's a problem about learning. And I know a lot of students use the online teaching method as an opportunity to say, well, I'll catch up with all that at the end of the year. I'll just concentrate on doing nothing now. Or I know a lot of students are just physically working now and never catch up with the materials week to week. I'd implore them not to get into that particular strategy. The other real problem with the online exam, an open book, is the dilemma of what to include and to leave out. You're in a sweet shop, you've got all these materials that you can put down on a piece of paper, but then you will be told, we only want the relevant stuff, discard the irrelevant stuff. And the temptation to cut and paste once you're online, you've got that material in front of you is great. And we've got to resist that to a certain extent, whilst at the same time not losing the benefit that we've got the materials there as a safety blanket and to ease the pressure, etc. And there will be an increased expectation of examiners regarding the content, the style. We don't expect you to make mistakes in terms of remembering cases and remembering statutes, etc., because the information is there. And you've got, particularly if it's online with 16 hours, you've got a lot of time to get your structure right. So there are more demands being placed on students for the online exam. But let's not forget the closed book examination, because that comes with, that brings with it all sorts of problems and sometimes mental problems. So how to prepare, and again, I'm going to concentrate on online, but I will mention closed book as well. Ensure as far as possible you know the format and content. Don't ask your fellow students, don't go to the exam and say, well, Gaz, Baz and Shaz told me it was this. I've only just opened the exam online. I believe it's been open since 6 o'clock. It's now 6 o'clock in the evening because Shaz, Gaz, Baz and Daz told me that it was opening at this particular time. So get it from your tutors, not your fellow students. Don't think you can revise on the day, even within 16 hours. I know a lot of students say, well, I'll just open it up, sometimes not even at 6 o'clock in the morning when it starts, and say, I'll have a look at the exam paper and then start revising or looking at it for the first time. It will lead to desperation. That will lead to exam nerves and real panic, and generally just leads to desperate cut and paste strategies. The ideal, and you're not the first set of students I've told this to, I've been telling them for 45 years, the ideal is to engage with the subject topics from day one and throughout the course and build up to the exam. So when you come to the exam, it's revision of the basic principles, not vision, not looking at it for the first time. If you haven't been able to do that, don't beat yourself up if you haven't been able to do that. One, if it's your fault, it's no use harping on about that it's your fault at this particular stage, and sometimes it's not your fault. But if you haven't been able to do that, start your preparation earlier to accommodate the vision, the understanding, the revision. So if, for example, you're in week 12 now and you've got an exam in a week's time, and you've hardly been to any lectures, you haven't picked anything up, well, you've got to start that revision and that vision. You've got to go over the basics first before you start revising. People say, oh, I'm going to revise. I said, no, you're not. You don't know anything yet. You'll revise once you've got the vision of that particular subject. Prepare your materials in advance. Particularly, this is obviously the online examination where it's open book. Prepare your materials in advance so that they're accessible on the day of the exam. So if I'm going to use books, my book is there at 6 o'clock when I open up the exam, and I've already read it. Also, any journals, cases, statutes, treaties, etc. You're not going to know, unless they're seeing questions, exactly what you're going to need. But you've got your basic armory there. You've got your basic arsenal, and that is your textbook, a couple of journal articles, which, you know, for each topic, etc. A list of cases, and if you can build up a little case note yourself, then that's always good. The statutes and treaties, everything that you're going to need. Now, if you've got the extra joy of it being a scene question, well, you know, double joy. You've got all the materials. In fact, what you've already done is prepare the answer, and then you just write it out as a rubber stamp on the day. But I'm not sure whether many exams are going to be on that. You're now in a position, if you've read those materials and you've got them accessible, is to say, right, let's have a look at the question and then just pick and choose from your particular sources. Now, you won't know exactly what the question means or what it's going to say, but you should be able to have easy access and say, well, yeah, I expected something like this to be coming up. I've got a list of cases which I'm going to use, and I've already made notes on those, and you just put them there. You're in a position to construct your answers at leisure, and I think that takes away a lot of the panic. If you're using that 4 hours, 16 hours, whatever it is online for vision, then there comes a point where you're going to panic, because there comes a point where you say, I don't fully understand that, and I'm running out of time, and now I'm starting to panic. Now the best way of dealing with this is to cut and paste. So it's all really a question of organization, but highlight and ensure you understand the key issues and the arguments. So it's not just a question of getting all the materials there and saying, right, I can't possibly fail now because I've got all the relevant materials and I can just call on them whenever I want. You've got to actually understand the issues and the arguments. So if you're talking about public policy and human rights in tort law, or you're talking about what the main purpose of a contract of employment is, no amount of sources is a substitute for you actually understanding what is a contract of employment and what is it supposed to do. Why do we impose vicarious liability? Not just what the rules are, but why do we impose vicarious liability? What is it, and why is it so controversial? And I think a lot of students forget about that. They say, no, when I signed up to do law, I knew it would be just lots of information which I can just put in randomly. Sometimes see the wood for the trees, just step back and say, what's all the fuss about? What's this dilemma? Why have they set us a question on employers' vicarious liability? What is the issue? What's the dilemma, etc.? Do I understand what the rule is and what it's there for? You answer a question on the Human Rights Act. Well, you can go through the whole act and tell me what the whole act means. But unless you understand what human rights are and why they're politically and constitutionally controversial, you're not going to answer the question which I'm setting. So always, just step back, understand the key issues and arguments. I'm sure we've all handed in coursework where we thought, well, I didn't get a bad mark for that, particularly as I never understood the rule of law, and I never really understood vicarious liability. Well, you probably understood it a little bit more than you're admitting to. But it's particularly important in an examination, because if you know the basics and what the question is principally about, you can pick and choose the materials and structure your answer and keep checking it as you go along. Don't just don't use the examination as your practice, as your rehearsal. Do rehearse that before, in advance. Give yourself give yourself an hour at home, a week or so before the examination. See if you can answer a question similar to the one that you think is going to come up in that particular time frame, using those particular materials or not using those materials, obviously, if you've got a closed book. And I've put there, suggesting an hour for each question, 1,500 words per answer, and a lot of people might gasp at that. But that's basically what we do at Coventry. We say you've got 16 hours, but we expect you to be writing properly all the time, for about an hour each question, and that should be between 1,000 and 1,500 words. So get used to that, particularly if you're going to do it on a closed book examination basis. Sit yourself down and say, all right, the question isn't seen, but I'm pretty sure it's going to look something fairly similar to this. Let's do a bit of revision. Let's do a bit of planning. Put the books to one side and say, right, let's see if I can do this in an hour and a quarter. You don't have to be that strict with yourself if it's going to be open book. If it's going to be closed book, you have to be a little more strict. And that really does help with the timing as well of, avoiding that situation where you write an hour and a half for one and 15 minutes for the other. If it is online, again, open the exam as soon as it opens. I would say, I've just remembered, it's a long time since we did have exams in exam halls, but the number of students who came in late was absolutely jaw-dropping. Obviously, if you've got your exam at 9 o'clock and it's in an examination hall, get there early, don't come in late. That's going to cause greater panic. But if it is online, open the exam as soon as it opens. Even if it opens at 6 o'clock in the morning and closes at 10 o'clock at night, open it early on. If only just have a look and say, that's what I was expecting. I can now get a cup of coffee and I can come back in an hour, etc. Or I can say, blimey, that's not what I was expecting. I'm glad I opened it at 6 o'clock because I've got a bit more time to do some research, etc. Don't put anything on that day. A lot of students get in touch with me an hour before the deadline or before the close of the exam and say, can I have an extra couple of hours because I've been working or I've been seeing my auntie or whatever? No, you can't. So don't get in that situation. Take time to read the paper. See that it connects with your expectations with respect to format and content and what you're going to have to write about. Check that the sources that you've prepared in advance are sufficient and appropriate. So a lot of people might be getting ready for the question, what are the sources of the British Constitution? You say, right, I've got chapter 1 of my textbook, that will do me quite nicely. And then it's a little more tricky saying, is this constitution truly constitutional, or is it in conformity with a true constitution in the wider sense? And you think, what I've got here in the chapter of my textbook isn't going to answer that. So I'm going to have to go look that up. Obviously, you haven't got that possibility with a closed book examination. If you've done no or little preparation for the exam, even if it's online and you've got 16 hours, but particularly obviously if it's closed book, you've got to be realistic. It's no use saying, well, I haven't done any work, but I'm still want a first and I'm still going to write a brilliant answer. One, you're just going to give yourself a nervous breakdown trying to do that. And you're just going to burn out. It's being realistic and say, right, I've under-researched for this. All right, I've got 16 hours, but 16 hours isn't going to be enough, or 10 hours isn't going to be enough to really research this. But at least I've got my basic materials. I've got my notes, I've got my textbooks, I've got my case books, etc. I can provide a satisfactory answer. If you say, the only way to pass or really do well in this is to do research, which is now too late to do, you're going to get in a real muddle, because you're going to get confused by all these sources which are beyond your ability and beyond your research. So sometimes it's best to be realistic and say, let's just play it safe, get the basics done, because remember, even the better students are going to be covering the basics as well. And use those materials, those solid sources, just to build up a satisfactory answer, rather than trying to write a scholarly and excellent piece in the limited time. Now, having said that, I'm old enough and ugly enough to know that I've come across students who've said to me at the end, actually, I didn't do any revision at all, but I used my natural brilliance in the examination, or particularly in online, just to revise it. I got through it out of common sense. There are not many of those, particularly in law. And I would always err on the side of caution that you're not one of those people who can do that. Don't run the risk of trying to do it. Oops. So this is a little bit about the closed book, and I think I've mentioned most of the issues as well, because I saw the poll. They are rare, but they are returning. I don't know whether they're 2 hours, 3 hours, etc., whether they're giving you longer, or whether they are turning into time-constrained assessments, rather like tests that you do within an hour, etc. Technique for revision is different, but the same rules apply regarding plan, structure, etc. If the questions are seen for the closed book exam, do as much early preparation as possible and rehearse your answers. That's all you're really doing. Even if you're going into a closed book exam, you've rehearsed the answer and you've got less to remember. You've just really got your perfect answer to remember. If you haven't, if they're not, start your revision as soon as possible, but prepare for exams from the start of the module. If you actually engage with the module early on, go to, I'm not saying all seminars, but most of them, and practice those particular skills and watch people answer questions and give answers, then it really does build up the confidence, because when you open the exam book, you say, it's basically what we did in seminars 2, 3, and 4, or one of 2, 3, and 4. If you're fully prepared, settle yourself, because there is that danger of, once you get in the exam room or even online, you just spew out all this information and you say, right, it's open now. I've got 10,000 words to talk about, and here it all is, etc. That's not a great strategy. Settle yourself, look at the exam paper carefully, and take a few minutes to draw a plan of your answers. So particularly if it's a 2 hour, obviously you haven't got all the time in the world there, but you still have got time to settle yourself, choose your question, and start drawing up a plan. Even if you lose 5 or 10 minutes of that valuable time, it's really important. And it's really important for those who have revised thoroughly, and some people over-revise. But if you're one of those that's really done a real good job on revision, is to say, I can't use all of this. Let me just think what I'm going to write about, etc. Allocate sufficient time to each question. We're always going to have a favorite question, and we know more about one area than the other, but allocate sufficient time to each question. Check that each answer is relevant. Keep checking. And I know that's difficult under time constrained conditions, but try and do that. And follow that structure, proofread. It is, I know, a bit more difficult to do it under closed book examinations. And that's why the rehearsals during the revision period are really important and really useful. That if you can sit yourself down 4 or 5 times and say, right, I'm going to pretend I'm in the exam and writing this particular question. It gets less scary when you're actually on stage and have to do it on the day. Again, if you're not fully prepared, be realistic. Think what you do know and how it can be used in answering the question. Don't ever write nothing. You know, there's loads of students who just walk out of an examination hall not having written anything, or written far too little. Sometimes you get to that point where you think, I don't know a great deal of content, but I have got certain skills. And these skills might be useful, even if I don't know a great deal of substantive law. There's an old saying, if you can't fight, get a big hat, so you look as if you can fight. And what you can do in this case is that if, for example, you go for a problem question, you don't know a great deal of law or the cases, etc., but you know the general principles, and you're very good at fact finding and problem solving, then actually you can provide a pretty good answer, and an answer that sometimes the heavily revised student can't answer because they're so busy telling us what the law is rather than giving advice. And so too with analytical skills. If you get a very theoretical question, sometimes you don't have to know a lot about the law, but you just have to have that sort of inquiring mind and philosophical mind, and are good at talking theory and philosophy, etc. Try and use those skills. We've all got skills which we're very good at. Sometimes if we're underprepared for an exam, it doesn't mean the end of the world. I'm not saying that this is a good strategy, but nevertheless, it's one that you can use.
Do we have time for a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, the next one. I've been quiet because there haven't been any on the chat, but one just popped up, so I thought I'd read it out now, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So the question is, what makes effective research? Where would you say is a good place to start looking, and what areas should we be looking into?
Right.
And then they've also followed that with, what is the line between revising and over-revising, which is probably common question.
Well, it's very difficult with an open book exam, with unseen questions, to know exactly what you will need. But what I would start off on basis that I've already had an opportunity to revise for this question, let's say an offer and acceptance, vicarious liability, because there was a question in the seminar. We did a seminar question on this. Now, if you go back to the reading list, which invariably you didn't fully read first time round, but is now a good source, you can say, right, let's go back to the basics. I always say start with your lecture notes and the slides and the lecture recordings, etc., because that gives you an idea of what the lecturer is likely to set an exam question on and what the lecturer really feels is important. Side by side with a good textbook. Again, don't open the cellophane for the first time when you're revising the book, or when the exam starts. So I would say side by side, using the textbook and getting all those basics. You now know what the basic framework is, what the rules are, the sub-rules, the cases, the statutes, the international treaties, etc. So in that sense, you've got a good start. Now, you also know that, or likely to know, that a question, half of it is just covering basic descriptive material. What are the sources of the British Constitution? And you know that your lecturer is always setting this question: has Britain really got a constitution? Well, I'll go to the textbook. That's not going to give me the answer to that. So I might have to read, let's say, a couple of journal articles on that. So I make some notes on those journal articles, and I have them ready, or I have them ready in my head if I'm going into a closed book examination. And the other thing is, then I can think you can start filling the gaps and making your revision more effective by looking at some cases. Now, you're not going to have time in the exam to put all the words of the case and all the facts of the case in, etc., but make little case books as you go along. So if I have to use the case of Carlisle and Partridge and whatever, then I've got a little case summary in my notes saying basic facts, what the decision was and what the importance of the case was, etc. So I think that's how you build up the revision. I think the second, or the revision sources, I think the second question was about over revision. And yes, I know you're going to look at a lot of information which you're not going to have time to use. Now, there's no escaping that. A lecturer doesn't go into a lecture and talk about consideration for 2 hours, and that's it. The power, the keg's dry, because they could go on for 10, 15, 20 hours talking about consideration. Thankfully, they don't. But similarly with a student, they should know more than that they're going to write and revise more than they're going to write, because then they can pick and choose what's really relevant. But what I'm talking about of over revising is that people read all of the chapters and, in several books, all of the possible journal articles, all of the cases, got everything there, and they can't possibly, and they're bursting at the seams. And quite apart from giving themselves a nervous breakdown trying to carry all this information, they're surely not going to be able to focus and say, really, what I should be concentrating on in my revision is having a good, solid knowledge of this, a very good knowledge of this, an overall knowledge of this, etc. I don't know, the person who asked the question, what problems he or she have. I mean, certainly the issue of over revising and people staying up till the early hours for weeks and weeks revising, etc. I'm not sure whether a great deal of that happens now, because we get more seen questions and much more focused courses. But obviously you can burn yourself out in the revision process. Some people get pretty far away from that, but some students do burn themselves out. So hopefully that will that's of use. I don't know if there are any other questions so far, Tim.
No, that's the only one so far. But as we said before, if you do have any questions, just pop them in the chat, and when we get a second, we will stop and answer those.
Yeah. This is really advice now on this slide of actually reading the question to find out, one, what is it generally about, and really, if it's a closed book exam, students are hoping that there's a question on parliamentary sovereignty. They're hoping that there's a question on invitations to treat. They're hoping there's a question on the duty of care, etc. So yes, you've got to identify what this is about. And that's a great comfort, because you see, yes, my question has come up, my legal area has come up. But going back to over revision, the one who's over revised, suddenly then spewing out this information without looking at the question. You've got to identify what the question is generally about, and what is it specifically about? What is its angle? What is its nuance? And the question we'll look at in a moment, has Britain truly got a constitution? That's really what I should be concentrating on. I can't write for an hour just saying these are the sources, these are the features. I've got to get into the question of what a constitution is, etc. So really have a look at the question. Always perhaps write that out in 2 sentences. The question is generally about offers and invitations to treat. It is specifically about whether the courts can make that distinction and whether they make it consistently and fairly in practice. So just 2 sentences say, right, I've got my focus now. Now I can start building my plan. I can look at my plan and I can consult my sources. I can say, have I got the materials here in front of me, or have I got them in my head? Build your answers carefully. Start with an introduction, because what an introduction can do sometimes is constitute a sort of little mini essay, and it just gives you the basics. It gets you going. saying, well, this is principally about distinction between offers and invitation to treat, and an offer has to be present if we're going to have a legally binding contract, but there is a difference between an offer, a formal offer, and an invitation to treat. And if we've got to, we've got to make that distinction, because if it's merely an invitation to treat, we can't accept at that particular point. So you've got something off your chest and out of your mind, and you've got quite a neat little introduction there. And then you can start building on it, building on your answers carefully, and making sure that you're following your plan and reading through each paragraph and say, right, does that paragraph go there, or should it be later or earlier, etc.? And is it actually answering the question? Now, obviously, this is going to take much longer if you haven't prepared your materials in advance. If you have got the advantage of an open book exam and it's online, etc., you've got time to structure, but it's going to take much more time to structure if, in fact, at the same time you're doing your revision. For unseen problem questions, we'll look at problem questions in a moment. Identify the general legal areas. This is about offer, invitations to treat, acceptance and revocation, or whatever it is, etc. And what are the factual issues? So if I make a list of factual issues, did Mary make an offer by putting this advert in the newspaper? Did Tom actually accept by saying, I will be round to have a look at the car in the morning, etc.? So you're just going through the problem scenario, picking out the legal factors and the factual matters. And that makes it a lot easier to fit in a structured answer at the end. And if, again, whether you've got an open book or a closed book examination, if you can, during your plan, say, yes, that's the first point, is there an offer? And at the same time, put at the side 2 or 3 cases that you're going to look at. And obviously a lot easier if you've got the materials in front of you, but it's such a comfort if you can say, right, I've got that plan. I know it takes up valuable time in a closed book examination when you've got one in an actual live examination, but it is always worth that 5 or 10 minutes. What not to write. You're not going to get rewarded for correct but irrelevant information. I think a lot of students find this quite difficult when they find this out at undergraduate level, where at school, we were given some reward for general information, even if it wasn't relevant. We weren't going to get marked down. Well, not only are you going to not get rewarded for it, sometimes you might get marked down because this is a random answer. It's the dartboard effect. You're just throwing darts randomly at the board, hoping you're going to hit the bullseye, and that's not a good strategy. But this is especially important in online and open book exams, because if you don't see what's relevant and what's not relevant, you're just going to be cutting and pasting from online books or sources, etc., and it's not going to be relevant to the question. And eventually the marker loses patience and says, this is not answering the question. Read the question carefully, as we said before. Keep checking that you're addressing and answering the question. You can't do that unless you've looked at what the question is about and you've got a plan. In a lot of questions, yes, you've got to provide some descriptive material. You've got to tell us what the rules are and some cases to support it, etc. But use that minimally, because there's usually something more important and specific that you've got to move on to. So don't be afraid of taking a paragraph or so just to basically say what the general rules of, let's say, vicarious liability are with some cases, etc. But try and dispense with that and then return to the question and say, right, now let's use these sources wisely and constructively. With problem questions, concentrate on the relevant legal areas. Don't say, well, this is a problem question about contract. Halfway through, you've gone through every area of contract and haven't even mentioned the scenario, is a way to fail it, etc. So with problem questions, concentrate on the relevant legal areas and the relevant issues. As I say, if you get a problem question, say it's about offer, acceptance, intention consideration, but these are the factual issues which I'm going to be talking about. When John did this, when Mary did this, when this letter was posted, when this telephone conversation was made, etc. And then if you've got those points in a chronological order, it's a lot easier to provide a much more structured answer. And for both, avoid overlong accounts of facts of cases, again, cutting and pasting from facts and decisions, etc. Get used to that before you get in the examination period of saying, right, here is a rule, let me use a case which says in 50 words, very brief facts and decision, but the importance of that case. So in this case, when this happened, the court held this, and that showed, therefore, that the real rule is X, Y, Z. And practice that whilst you're preparing for lectures, preparing for seminars. So it becomes second nature when you do it in examinations. Because if you try that trick for the first time in an examination, you quite naturally really do become unstuck. With normal exams and in online exams, make sure you're supporting your answers by primary and secondary sources. Be prepared to use them constructively. Don't say, all right, I've got all these cases that I can call upon, and I can just fill in the page by cutting and pasting facts and decision, etc. That is not going to get you in. So don't use them to cut and paste onto your exam paper without analysis. Remember, you're using sources to give your answer authority. This is your answer, your essay question, your problem answer. You've solved the issues, but we know, you know that we require some legal sources. So use that case to provide some evidence. Use that statute to provide some authority. Use that academic opinion to support your argument or to counter your argument, etc. So make sure that the sources actually enhance your answers. And again, you're practicing, you should be practicing this throughout the whole of the term.
We have another question that might fit in at that point. They've just asked about distinguishing the important bits out of a detailed textbook, and just said that it's easy to get lost in all the information. And would you recommend looking at different textbooks? And they followed that with ones that are not necessarily on the university reading list.
Right. Yeah, I think there are always a variety of textbooks. I always say that if you're not going to use the reading list, always consult with your module leader. And I can hear a heavy sigh now. Well, I'd never do that because I know that they would say, don't read that. But you know, do that. If they've given you 3 or 4 suggestions and you're thinking, no, none of them really suit, but I found something online, or I found another textbook which I really am getting on with, even if you're going to get a sigh from the lecturer saying, well, come on, don't use that material, you know, run that particular risk, because sometimes they might say, yeah, that's fine if you're going to do a question on this, or you're looking to do problem questions, etc. It's not very good if you get these types of questions. So always run it past your lecturers. I suppose really I would have to say that if there are a number of alternative texts, then you should be able to find one on that particular reading list which suits your skills and suits your understanding. You know, for example, you get EU law. A lot of people use Craig and de Burgh. Well, you know, it's absolutely massive, and a lot of students find it completely baffling. But our lecturer says, okay, let's go down and try this particular textbook, get the basics, and then if you're doing a coursework on something specific or an exam on something specific, go back to Craig and de Burgh. So be careful with using materials that are not on the reading list. And I know a lot of people use them. One, because they're much easier to find. And secondly, they're much easier to understand. But what you don't want to find out is that the reason they're easier to understand is that they are sub-degree texts and aren't going to be any great use to you in an examination or as a source in a coursework. So either confronting the lecturer or having a look at reading lists, etc., and often looking at the do's and don'ts that they put. Don't read Wikipedia, don't read lawteacher.net. And again, I'm sorry if there are lots of sighs out there by saying, oh, that's what I do use. Don't use those because the lecturer is not going to be, the marker's not going to be impressed with that. Yeah. Anything else?
No, that's it for now.
Okay.
So carry on.
All right, lovely. There's something there about citing and referencing sources. If it's a closed book examination, don't worry about citing and referencing too much. If you can't remember cases, then just say there was a case that established this particular principle. So too with sections and subsections of statutes, etc. Although there are some, if you're doing a criminal law exam, we'd expect you to know what sections 1 to 4 and a number of other sections in the Theft Act, and so too with the Human Rights Act. But don't get too worried about that. In an examination, it's fine to reference a textbook, Foster Human Rights, page 6, etc. You don't have to give the Oscular referencing, etc. For cases, if you can remember the case at all, just put the first name or the main, the GCHQ case, the Miller case. We know basically what we're talking about, etc. Don't use, rely on or cite lecture slides and notes. Learn them by all means, have them as the basis of your research, but don't cite them as your main source. So in exams, we're a lot more relaxed. A little less relaxed, of course, in the open book exam where you can have time to reference properly. But even then, I don't think we insist that you use footnotes and the full Oscular referencing system. Yeah. Something about proofreading. Well, I think we've probably gone over that enough. I'm just going to finish off with some examples. And we'll start with contract law. I know that not all of you are first years, and some of you may already have done contract or already getting used to contract, but I think you could use this as a typical subject. Even when you get into the third year, you're doing things like equity and trusts, etc. How to answer contract law questions can serve a purpose throughout. So I would say answers to contract law questions require a consistent and clear use of case law and statutory provisions. You know what it is with contract. There are lots of rules. Most of those rules come from case law, and then you get the odd statutory provision, Consumer Rights Act and UCTA and sale of goods, etc. The rules are fairly logical. They don't raise any policy or political dilemmas, and a lot of students hate that. Don't ask me, whether people should have the right to die. I'm 18 years of age. I can't solve these world's problems, etc. I don't want to solve them. Contract I like because they're basic principles. No one's asking you to solve any real moral dilemmas. But in contract, and what we'll see in tort as well, there is a legal logic to things, and there are certain legal reasonings and legal principles. The necessity in contract of things like commercial certainty and fairness, etc. But generally, you've got your rules and your cases and statutes. You've got your sub-rules, cases and statutes, and exceptions to those sub-rules, cases, and it's fairly straightforward. So what we're hoping for is this ideal question, by the use of case law, explain how the courts have distinguished between contractual offers and mere invitation to treat. Absolute godsend, because it's the easiest part of contract, and all I have to do is learn the rules, or I know the rules anyway, but keep peppering them with cases, cases are always pretty memorable, so you can, and understandable, etc. The only difficulty with that question is that I've added the word critically. So the average student tells us what the definitions are, the cases, and several examples of these cases where something was an invitation to treat, something was an offer, etc. But the good student will say, yeah, there's a theme in these cases. The courts are particularly, they particularly look at these factors, the commercial necessity, the fairness, etc., etc. So when you're asked to do something critically, even in contract, you've got to look back, step back and say, right, what's all this about? Why do we have to make the distinction in the first place? Well, one, because the parties want to know. And secondly, we want to know whether the courts are applying common sense here or whether they're applying commercial necessity, see if there's any theme. So, but contract is usually, I'm not saying for the non-thinking student, but I think it's a welcome for a lot of students to say, as long as I know my rules and cases, I can't go wrong. But let's look at the next question. So everybody chose the offer and invitation to treat question for contract. That was an absolute godsend. But then you've got a question on remedies. You don't fancy that at all. The option is a mechanism employed by the courts to imply terms into a contract is both unfair and inconsistent. Critically discuss this statement, and initially you go, wow, help, what on earth does that actually mean? Don't panic. If you know something about implied terms, you can use a lot of descriptive information. You've just got to focus your answer a little more. Don't be put off by the wording of the question. You can still need to know the basics, principles. Obviously, if you haven't revised implied terms, you're in trouble. But if you have, don't be put off by the complexity of the words of the question. It requires a case law approach. You need to be aware of the various cases and explain the various circumstances where terms can be employed. And that's fairly descriptive, but it is much more difficult than the first one. You have to identify principles running through the cases by looking at certain concepts: reasonableness, certainty, commercial necessity. And you will inevitably, if you're being asked more theoretical questions, will have to rely much more on academic sources than purely primary sources, which you could use for the first question. So again, it's just getting into that skill of being able to use an academic opinion, saying Foster says this for this particular reason, and I agree or disagree because that supports this particular evidence, etc. So you've got a question, even in straightforward, untheoretical contract, which does require you to get your head round certain concepts. Remember, law's there and cases are there for a particular purpose, to set a precedent and make the law better. And if in fact the decisions are all inconsistent and unforeseeable, then it's not achieving the purpose, etc. You will need to understand what is meant by illogical and inconsistent, because you're never going to answer the second part of the question unless you know what does that actually mean. What do they mean is illogical? What do you mean that it's inconsistent? Well, sometimes the best way of finding out what the judge meant is seeing what he or she said in that particular judgment. You can certainly do that with coursework and on online examinations. It's likely that even in a closed book exam, I'm going to set that quote because I've already introduced you to the quote in the seminars and the lectures already. So it's always best just to go back to the initial source and see what they're talking about. But that one just requires a little bit more thought. Now, problem questions. Here we've got a fairly, looks quite long problem scenario. It's not that particularly difficult, and it is on basically adverts, invitations to treat, etc. And it's principally the World Cup is coming on, and a particular television company say, right, we're trying to sell more televisions during the World Cup. You can get a £500 return if you buy before this particular date, and we're going to give you a certain sum of money for every goal that England score. You know, that's usually a safe bet because they usually score 2 or 3 and then are knocked out. But in recent years, that could be quite a bonus. And basically, you can see at the end, a lot of students find it difficult finding out what the factual issues are, but this one has already given the factual issues and the actual claims. They say the following: the original advert wasn't legally binding, and if it was binding, then the advert should be subject to a number of provisos, etc., etc. So that's a nice problem question, because not only is it on offers, invitations to treat, and construction of terms, which isn't too difficult, it's not consideration or restitution, etc., but it lays down the nice framework of your answer. Firstly, you're going to have to find out, is this original advert legally binding by applying the rules of offers, invitations to treat, unilateral offers, etc. And then I just have to go through the factual issues as they've been laid down in the question. So when we go on to answer that problem question, what I always used to say with a problem question is write a little introductory paragraph by saying, this question is about this area of law, and it raises these particular issues. I don't think you need to for this one, because the examiner has been nice enough to say, these are the issues that I want you to deal with. You don't have to find them yourself. You have to answer them, of course, but you don't have to find them yourself. So if we're going to provide a good answer to that, what do we need to know? You have to identify what the relevant areas of contract law are. Well, in that case, it's already sorted. Even if they haven't given you the issues, you would have gone through very similar questions in seminars and other courseworks, etc. So you know it's about the formation of contract, but whether adverts constitute legally binding contracts, etc. You know it's about the terms of the contract. There's a little bit of consideration and tension there, but basically it's formation of the contract and terms. Now you've got to be ready to provide a clear and simple answer, which is going to be a good answer for the layperson, i.e. Sony TV, and a good answer for me, who's going to be marking it as an academic. So you've got to blend good academic, strong legal skills, but with an ability to explain that quite simply to a person who would find this quite confusing. And they don't want an essay on offers and invitations to treat. They don't want to know what Professor X and Y say about this. They want a straightforward answer to the problem question. So there, it's absolutely vital we've got the plan. Provide a brief introduction. Well, it has to be very brief in this case because they've really provided that for you. And then consider the points in issue. You've already got a plan, so you just follow those. The difficulty in this question is that a lot of the answer is up here in your brain. It's not, you can't be found in a textbook or in a case. You know the basic rules, yeah, and you can get those from a book or an article or a case, etc. But it's you looking at the facts and saying, when he did this, does that mean this or does it mean that? So in that sense, excuse me. In that sense, a lot of it is down to your analytical and problem-solving skills. If you know the basic rules and some cases to support it, a really good answer to this is to say, let's have a look closely at the words of that advert and whether it was a contractual offer rather than invitation to treat, and what was meant by 10, up to 10 goals or for every goal, etc. What is a goal? A lot of that's nothing to do with being a lawyer. It's to do with being just an intelligent human being who can look at a set of facts and say, well, it might mean this and it might mean that. I think it's more likely, it's more logical to mean this. So that's what I was saying before. If you haven't got a lot of gas in the tank, in the sense that you haven't got a massive amount of rules and cases, sometimes you can get yourself through an examination by using your common sense and your problem-solving skills and your analytical skills, not to the exclusion of content, but just to bolster the fact that you haven't got a massive amount of content. So lots of students would fill that answer with endless examples of invitations to treat. Some of them would get straight to the point, use one or two cases and say, having looked at the words of the statute, I think it means this, I think it means that, etc. And obviously, problem questions are an issue anyway. Doing them in exams, I think under exam constraints, is even more difficult. So it's practice throughout the whole term. In tort, very similar subject. Lots of people, if they like contract, they tend to like tort because they say it's basic principles and basic case. You know, you need to know your case law, and you'll have your odd statute, your Occupiers Liability Act, etc., etc. But the difference, I think, in something like tort is that when I studied tort, it was easy because there was no public policy and no human rights. But eventually the courts got to a point where they say, we don't want to establish liability in that case for psychiatric loss, medical negligence, liability of public authorities. And tort law was either ruined or made more interesting, depending on your viewpoint, by these principles of public policy and human rights. So it's not just a question now of saying, is there a duty of care in that case? It's very often a question, should there be a duty of care in that case? So tort has become a little bit more complex, etc. So when you get a question, the development of the close connection test in Lister has imposed an unfair burden on employers for the actions of their employees. With reference to relevant case law, discuss the accuracy of that statement. Yes, you need to know the essential rules of vicarious liability in all the cases, but you've got to look at those sources in the context of a dilemma. There's always a dilemma in an interesting question. The dilemma here is it fair that an employee can go and thump somebody on a petrol forecourt, thump a customer, and then the customer goes and sues the employer instead of the employee? Is that fair? And are the cases consistent, etc.? And now a bit of public policy is coming in. Is the public policy always give the victim the employer to sue because they've got deeper pockets? Or should we say, no, why isn't the employee liable in this case? Why should the employer be liable? So usually tort comes after contract, usually comes in year 2 or year 3. And in that case, we are requiring a little bit more of you. And finally, in terms of either the dreaded or the wonderful concept, subject of constitutional law or human rights. Constitutional law and human rights are either loved by students, sometimes not for the right reasons. They say, I like constitutional and human rights because there's no law in it. It's just your own opinion. And I know a little bit about politics, and I've done government and politics. That's a dangerous strategy and a dangerous viewpoint. But human rights and constitutional law as subjects do require much more thought and more skills. If you get a question such as that, Human Rights Act is fundamental need for reform, no longer fit for purpose. There's a quote there from the Secretary of State for Justice in 2021. Is it a legal question or a political question? Do you take a legal approach and use legal sources, or do you need to be aware of constitutional law and constitutional and political principles? And the answer to both of those questions is both. In constitutional law and human rights, they are legal subjects. You need to know cases and statutes and treaties and academic opinion, etc. But there's a lot more scope whether you like it or not, for saying, do you agree with this politically? Do you agree with it constitutionally, etc.? So never neglect the law in a constitutional exam. I know a lot of students like to do that. Oh, I like constitutional because you never have to use any cases. Well, you should be using cases, but perhaps less cases than you do in contract, and using cases which actually explain the political or constitutional viewpoint. So to answer a question like that, you need to know, well, why was the Act passed in the first place? What does it say? What do the sections say? What's the case law? All right, fairly descriptive stuff. But then on top of that, what are the constitutional and legal problems that it's created? And a lot of students at this point say, hell, I'm no good at that sort of thing. Well, that's the way if you've been taught that way in the lectures and the seminars, they will always be saying, what does the Human Rights Act say? And what difficulties might that create with the judicial powers of the court? Why might politicians not think that's a good idea, etc.? So to answer questions in constitutional law and particularly in human rights, you need that good blend of knowing what the law means, but what effect that law is having on politics, society, citizens' rights, constitutional issues, etc. And of course, aside from human rights and constitutional law, you might in fact get similar questions or similar areas, both in your third year, and I know there might be one or two master's students here. Because when you're doing things like public international law, international human rights, international criminal law, corporate social responsibility law, etc., then you have to learn the rules in the context of these principles and concepts and aspirations. This is what the world of human rights should look like. This is what the law of human rights should look like. This is how people should conduct themselves diplomatically and internationally. These are the international problems, etc. So I think if you crack it in the first year in terms of, I cracked constitutional law because I know it's a mixture of law and politics and constitutionalism. Then when you get on to even things like criminal justice modules, public international law modules, etc., you can see that there's a lot more to those subjects and the questions that you're asked than here, what are the rules and the cases? And we're going to give you a first class if you can remember all the rules. It's really being a bit more analytical and thoughtful about the subject. So that would be just an idea of how you would structure that particular answer, making sure you're getting that blend. You understand all the recent political hoo-ha about it. You know what the law is, you know what the cases are, and then you keep revisiting the proposals and then come up with solutions based on your legal knowledge and your appreciation of the issues as to what the answer should be. So they're often more challenging, particularly under exam conditions. And I would say as a final point that if you get that, particularly in a 2-hour exam where you've only got an hour to do it, you've really got to be very careful how you plan your time, because there's lots of issues to talk about. And that plan that we've got there, outlining the issues, talking about the legal issues, the Human Rights Act, the sections, the case law, and then referring back to the political and constitutional arguments, that has to be handled really carefully. Otherwise, it ends up a real dog's breakfast, and we don't necessarily want that. I don't know whether there are any questions, but that's the final slide that we've got. If we've got any questions, then please.
We do have a couple. So going back to sort of summarising cases, this person's asked, what would you say about summarising cases? Some tutors say to read the cases in full, but there's already a substantive amount of reading for each module and around 10 additional cases per module.
Yeah.
Time management can be tricky. Any advice?
Right. Yeah, I sympathize there. The reason we ask students to read cases is not just so that they can use them in examinations. Sometimes if you read a leading case in tort or contract, it's a great way of learning the whole of that particular area. Because if you read the judgment of the Supreme Court, they will start off with an overview of the law. So sometimes reading a leading case from the Supreme Court or the House of Lords is not only a very good way of getting the detail of the judgment in that case, but getting a very good overview. I think apart from that, you've got to be, you've got to discriminate. You've got to be fairly careful as to what you're going to be able to manage and read, etc. We can't, particularly in 10-week semesters, be reading dozens and dozens of cases every week, etc. The one point you mentioned at the start is that, well, you're asking us to summarize the case in 50 words, and the case report is 2,000 words. Well, yeah, that is the issue. You have to read the case to fully understand it and then be able to paraphrase it or digest it in 50 words. But I would be practical in this case. I think what is a very good tip is, let's see how very good textbooks use cases to explain facts and decision, but the context of that case within the overall rules. How are cases explained in good journal articles? So that can be a very good pointer of how people have managed to paraphrase in 50 or 100 words, a 10,000 word judgment. Now, that's they are expert at doing that. And if you can borrow that style and acquire that particular skill, again, particularly throughout the whole of the module, by saying, well, I know there are 4 or 5 cases here. Let's just have a case note book of my own, just explaining what the facts are, what is the importance of this particular case. But there's no getting away from the fact sometimes you do have to read the whole of the case. But I wouldn't get too desperate about that, because if you read the right case, it's going to give you a very good overview of the subject area. So if, for example, you're going to write an essay, coursework or an exam on vicarious liability, after you've read your basic slides, I would say go and read the latest Supreme Court decisions on vicarious liability, because they will go through the whole history of it, all the cases that you need to know, and all the points of controversy before they actually address the judgment in that case. So you can use that as a multi-source. So don't be afraid of using, but be practical. You can't, if lecturers are saying you must be reading 15 full judgments every week for all of your 4 modules, then I think that's a bit harsh. But make the most of them. Case books are often very good as well, because they condense the full facts and judgments, etc.
Thank you. We've just been asked about the recording, so I'll just quickly take this advantage to say that the recording will be available on YouTube, and I will be sending out a link to the video, so don't worry about that. And we've got a couple of people asking about critically analysing. So one person said you spoke about the theme of the critically exam questions. Can you explain or give an example, please? And then another student has asked, how do you critically analyse?
Right, okay. Yeah. If you ask the question to students, you say, what do I mean when I say critically analyse? They will almost invariably say, consider both sides of the argument. And principally, that's what it is. Considering both sides, weighing up both, at least more than one argument. But when I say to the student, right, what are the two arguments then in terms of vicarious liability? What are those advantages and disadvantages? They'd say, I don't know, I'm going to have to read somebody's account on that. No, get to understand and appreciate what the arguments are. So if, for example, we use the example of vicarious liability, is it consistent? Is it fair? Now, just step back and think, why do we have vicarious liability? That's because if somebody's doing a job for an employer and benefiting the employer, when they do something wrong, it seems to make justice that the employer would be liable and not the employee. Because if the victim sues the employee, they haven't got any money, it's a fruitless exercise. So not only has the employer got deeper pockets, but it seems to be just that if the employee is benefiting the employer every working day, then they should pay for the penalty. Yeah. On the other hand, with the growth of really expert employees who've got expertise, and you get a lot of cases which seem to be saying, yeah, you can be liable for almost anything, an assault, a criminal assault, sometimes a personal feud, etc. You say something's out of hand here, that the case law is getting unfair or it's getting inconsistent, and it's losing its initial ideas, and it's losing its initial principles. These are just bandying ideas about. You're thinking, but I think what I've done now is that it wasn't easy, but I thought through what the dilemmas are, what the pros and cons are. So I am now at a point that I can go and research and find out what these people are critically analyzing. So you've got to understand the rules. You can't critically analyze something you don't understand or you don't know. And you've got to appreciate those rules and what those dilemmas are, however simple they are or complex they are. But if you've had a good go at doing that, the way is clear now to say, now I've done it in my sort of very rough and rough way, but I know that there are articles out there that have looked at this in detail, and I will be able to use those arguments in my essay. And goodness me, now I've gone through actually doing it myself and thinking about it, how much clearer Professor X and Professor Y are when I basically know what they're talking about, because they're talking about the same dilemma. It's just that they're more expert in explaining it and have got more knowledge than me. But at least they're basically, we've all got the basic building blocks. But so many students think, I know how to critically analyze. I'm going to use Professor X, Y, and Z and their particular views. But if you were to ask them, what are those views? Why is he coming from this angle? And why is Y coming from this angle? I don't know, but I know I'm going to use those particular angles and those particular views, etc. I don't really understand myself. Take a little bit of time understanding. And you can do that throughout the whole of the semester. In the lectures, when the lecturer says, now let's take a little bit of time to think about that and what fairness it's creating or unfairness, don't, what students used to do is just put their pens down and have a little break for a couple of minutes. What students do now is go on their phone and miss the really interesting and important bit, breaking down and demystifying these rather complex issues, which are eventually going to confront you in an exam or a coursework. So, yeah, that's what I regard as critical analysis and legal reasoning. If you want to go back to my textbook, which is Legal Writing Skills, there is a chapter there about legal reasoning and critical analysis and critical thinking. and you might find that useful. But in a way, it's rather simple. Don't try and critically analyze something until you know what the rule means and you appreciate what the dilemma is.
Thank you. So what else have we got? One student has asked if they could get some advice on employment law.
Right.
I'm not sure if that's
okay.
one of your
Well, I
areas
can give you some some advice in terms of what sort of subject it is and what sort of questions you get. Because whether that's good for the student or not, there's a lot more policy, there's a lot more human rights in employment law than there used to be. So you're getting all sorts of questions now about employees' rights, work directives, etc., things about maternity rights, equality, etc. You're getting a lot more questions about the Equality Act and the interpretation of the Equality Act. And as I say to my students who didn't want to do human rights in the first semester, you might thank me when you do employment law, because a lot of the law that you do in employment law, particularly on the Equality Act, has to do with human rights. In fact, I write co-jointly with my employment law colleague case notes on equality and free speech, equality and religious rights, etc. So I think that's always worth looking for. You obviously get some questions which aren't about human rights. What I would say is that if you're good at contract and understand contract and terms and formation and remedies, etc., there's a lot of that in employment law, because not wishing to denigrate it, employment law is a fancy contract law. It is a specific type of contract, the contract of employment. So if you're good at things like expressed and implied terms, the intention of the parties, the formation of the contract, etc., there's lots there. When you come to things like unfair dismissal and redundancy, there are lots of statutory regulation there. So you have to get your head around Redundancy Payments Act, Employment Rights Act, etc. Lots of statutory sections which will take you through the rules. And there's usually lots of cases to back that up. So don't go for employment law if you, well, two things I'd say. Don't go for employment law if you think there's not going to be any case law, because there's lots of it. On the other hand, if you do like things like human rights and talking about things like fairness and inequality of bargaining power, there's lots of latitude there as well, because you could answer a question, let's say, on equality and employment law without knowing a massive amount of the contract of employment, but knowing quite a bit about human rights, European Convention, human rights, and the purpose of equality legislation, non-discrimination. So there's a bit for everybody there, I think. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Yeah, I hope so too. Janelle, if you have any other questions, then just pop them in the chat, but hopefully that's answered your question. So we've only got one more question in the chat, and that's, how do you synthesize your arguments in an essay?
How do you synthesize them?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's always this long-lasting issue of, do I give my opinion? And do I have to give my opinion? Generally, we're not interested in your personal opinion on things. We're interested in your informed opinion once you know the rules, appreciate those rules, and appreciate higher academic authority than yourself, whether that comes from textbooks or from journal articles or from academic opinions of judges, etc. I think what you might mean by synthesizing them is that I would always go back to the the PEE system of paragraphs, and that is you make a particular point, you provide the evidence, whether that evidence be an academic argument or a case, etc., and you then at the end evaluate that particular point. You synthesize it, you bring it all together. So you're saying there is this point about vicarious liability, whether it's inconsistent. We've got these two decisions which appear inconsistent, and the judges think they're inconsistent, or the academics think they're inconsistent. And then before you move on to the next point, this question of synthesis is you provide some solution to that in the context of the question that you're being set. Remembering that the judges and the academics haven't seen the question that you've been set, you are now bringing it all together. And you're bringing it together by putting together your knowledge of the law, an appreciation and a knowledge of counter arguments, and then eventually synthesizing it by putting that all together as an explanation of how it all fits in relation to answering the question. So I think that's a particularly good strategy for when you're answering a critical question, is that you know the law, you appreciate it, you appreciate the dilemma, and you can put it all together in terms of what the question is asking. Because there's got to be a bit of everything there.
Great. So other than some thank yous and saying it's a well-detailed subject, I think we are done. There's no more questions.
Right.
So as I said, I'll be sharing the link to the video and the slides after the event. So I'm just keeping an eye out for my email. And I'll pop in the details about Steve's books as well. So don't worry, you'll get a link on that.
All right, thank you. Right.
And yeah, over to you, Steve.
Yeah, just a final point that although we've concentrated on exams, a lot of this applies to all forms of assessment, even courseworks, of looking at the question. Obviously, you've got a bit more leisure time with courseworks. So I would say a lot of these practical steps can be used in coursework assessments as well. Final point is, if you are tested by a mixture of courseworks and exams, don't spend all of the term writing your courseworks and concentrating on your courseworks, and then leave the final week of the semester for examinations, because there will be a crying, there will be a wailing and a gnashing of teeth. It will end with tears. So just try and keep, consistently learning the rules, practicing them in seminars, etc. I suppose the final point, hopefully enjoy it. It's a great privilege studying law. So I wouldn't say it's a great privilege writing examinations in law, but enjoy it as much as you possibly can.
Thank you very much. And when you log out, there will be a short survey. If you do have time to complete that, that helps us improve our events for the future.
Great.
So yes, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Steve, for your very detailed session. I think the students will be really appreciating that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether I'm going to get as many hits on YouTube as the talking cat or whatever, but
maybe not.
Maybe not.
But let's hope you get to a few. So yeah, okay. So when I click end webinar, that will sort of make the event disappear for everyone. So just a quick final goodbye and thank you very much.